numbers might not be enough. "Don't let Zhao Qi through," they screamed. 100,000 gold and a title to whoever kills the false emperor. They urged their men forward, shouting that today was the day to win glory and build a legacy. Their words were filled with irresistible temptation and the promise of vast rewards. Hearing this, the generals felt their hearts race. Greed began to burn in their eyes, fueled by pure excitement and desire. It was a powerful motivator, if a dangerous one. A roar echoed through the clouds as the soldiers surged forward like an unstoppable tide, desperate to claim the prize. Zhao Qi, however, showed no fear. He laughed wildly as his crescent halberd swept through the air, leaving only wails in its wake. The battlefield quickly transformed into a living hell. To be perfectly honest, it was a scene of absolute carnage. The ordinary soldiers and generals couldn't slow him down for a second. They were like mantises trying to stop a carriage. Almost effortlessly, he cut down thousands more. Seeing this, the noble leaders lost all their composure as terror took hold. Fear surged through them like a rising tide. Some leaders desperately ordered their men to block his path, their voices trembling. Others didn't even bother with orders. Under the protection of their personal guards, they began to flee toward the horizon. Their retreating figures as they scrambled for safety looked exceptionally pathetic. In the hearts of these men, life was far more precious than any treasure. However, wanting to retreat now was simply too late, especially since they had been his targets from the very start. If they wanted to escape, they would have to ask him first. A moment later, we see him brandishing his flashing weapon amidst the chaos. Like a fierce dragon, he surged forward. Dozens of enemy soldiers threw themselves at him like moths to a flame, which, to be honest, was a suicide mission. With a few casual strikes, he acted as a cold judge, harvesting the souls of those brave but ill-fated warriors without a second thought. At this moment, two leaders who hadn't managed to escape yet felt their bodies tremble uncontrollably, letting out terrified shouts. "You cannot kill us. We are of royal blood," they cried, falling to their knees in a desperate plea for mercy. In an instant, a dazzling silver light pierced the sky. Accompanied by two dull thuds, two bursts of blood sprayed into the air. Afterward, he looked down coldly at those two faces frozen in eternal terror. He didn't care about their royal status at all. To him, their titles were a joke. In this camp, he saw them as nothing more than pathetic remnants of a fallen dynasty. As he spoke, he casually cut down the two high-ranking commanders right then and there. The surrounding soldiers witnessed this and were struck with absolute horror. Their screams echoed through the clouds, announcing that their leaders were dead. His Highness has fallen. The panic spread through the ranks like a plague, and who could blame them for being terrified? Despair and chaos were written across the faces of the soldiers. Meanwhile, the 800,000 fierce warriors of the Zhao family army were showing their own terrifying power. Like an unstoppable torrent, they completely shattered the enemy's defensive lines. On the other side, Zhao Qi locked onto the fleeing kings. Like a tiger descending a mountain, he charged toward them once again. Everywhere he passed, he left a storm of blood in his wake. Any soldier or general who stood in his way fell in a matter of seconds. The fleeing leaders ran for their lives, but as time passed, those who once marched under the banner of crushing rebels all ended up as fallen souls in the dust of history. Half an hour later, he stood tall in armor, now dyed a deep, visceral red. Under the terrified gazes of the remaining generals, the soldiers of the Zhao family army raised their blood-stained weapons in a roar of triumph. They cheered fervently and without end. High upon the city walls, Empress Dafeng had watched the entire process unfold. Her face was a canvas of shock, horror, and a deep, gnawing regret. If she had only known he possessed such terrifying combat power, she wouldn't have been foolish enough to court death. To be honest, she would have treated him like a sacred ancestor. Meanwhile, the soldiers and generals of the Zhao family army began clearing the battlefield. This single strike had shattered a coalition of 1.2 million men. It left 200,000 dead or wounded, 400,000 routed, and 600,000 captured. Our own Zhao family army, originally 800,000 strong, had suffered over 10,000 casualties. Later, whenever the coalition survivors caught even a glimpse of his gaze, they didn't hesitate. They howled in terror and surrendered immediately, throwing their weapons as far as possible. They knelt with hands high, fearing that a single wrong look would get them cut down. He hadn't lost his mind to the point of slaughtering prisoners. A true man knows when to act. These soldiers were not to blame. They were merely following orders. In the days that followed, a new storm began to brew within the capital. The remnants who had escaped the first net, along with the noble families who had plundered the people, faced the total purge. Countless treasures of gold and silver were hauled out of their opulent mansions, filling the once empty national treasury to the point that they had to build 8 temporary warehouses just to hold the overflow. Lu Ruashi, who had spent her reign plagued by financial headaches, could only gnash her teeth in bitter hatred. She cursed those noble families, those parasites who had bled the nation dry. She had always intended to dismantle their power through centralized control, but she never imagined they had hidden away such massive mountains of wealth. Had she known, she would have raided their homes long ago, regardless of the blow to her reputation. With such riches, she wouldn't have been so helpless. Of course, that was merely a what-if after witnessing his inhuman performance on the battlefield. Lu Ruashi understood one thing. If he chose to rebel, even 1,000,000 men couldn't stop him. A few days later, the sensational news of the Battle of the Capital swept across the land like a gale. In an instant, many noble families and factions turned pale with fright, their voices trembling as they whispered in horror. From every mansion, similar screams of disbelief could be heard. And on this day, something else occurred. Countless exquisite vessels were smashed to pieces in fits of rage. But whether the nobles believed the news or not, the truth remained unchanged. In an instant, as the majestic ranks of the Zhao family army stood tall outside the city gates, the reality of the situation became undeniable. Their heart-shaking momentum made all doubt and disbelief turn pale and weak. These ironclad facts were impossible to ignore. Like the first light of dawn piercing a shroud of night, the truth was so radiant that even those who closed their eyes and ears could not escape it. And so, we see scenes of people welcoming the royal army blooming across the land. The local power holders, realizing the tide had turned, changed their tune. One by one, they came forward with fawning smiles to offer their submission. In just over 10 days, the political landscape had shifted shifted entirely. However, the remaining court officials and generals were beginning to worry. After 2 rounds of purges, the surviving civil officials of the previous dynasty were scarce. With the new system in place, the top ministerial positions sat empty, and the lower ranks were being filled by whoever was left standing. Having temporary staff in charge was a recipe for disaster. Hearing the pleas of his few remaining ministers, Xiaji began looking for talent to serve Great Qin. He eventually agreed to their requests. To be honest, even the most brilliant leader cannot build a nation without capable hands to do the work. He considered establishing imperial exams to recruit scholars from humble backgrounds, but there was a problem. There weren't enough literate people left. The country still needed to function, but asking illiterate nobles and soldiers, who only knew how to shout "His Majesty is invincible," to govern was a tall order. It was, quite frankly, like trying to drive ducks onto a perch. For now, he needed a transitional group to keep the wheels of state turning. After the court sessions, he would return to the harem to vent his frustrations with Lu Ruashi. He realized he might have purged the officials a bit too quickly. On the second day of his reign, he found himself back with Lu Ruashi. His soldiers were brave, certainly, but they lacked the brains for administration. It was a massive headache. By the third day, feeling thoroughly annoyed by the bureaucracy, he sought out the company of our favorite Sundra Empress again. It was an amusing cycle in a way. More than 10 days later, deep within the palace, we find him lying on the dragon bed, utterly drained. The constant demands of governance had left him more exhausted than any battle. Lu Ruashi, stretching lazily beside him, couldn't help but comment. She noted that while conquering the world is easy, ruling it is the real challenge. She had spent her own reign plagued by these same daily headaches. She expressed a hope that he could endure it longer than she did. He simply raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in his eyes as he prepared to show her his stamina. Lu Ruashi watched him, curious to see what this rebel would do next, while the court officials began sending out their messengers. They dispatched subordinates across the Wu dynasty to recruit talent, but they met with a total disaster, a Waterloo of sorts. One old scholar simply told them he was too aged and that the new emperor should look elsewhere before showing them the door. At the estates of the top-tier families, the response was even harsher. They claimed a mere warrior didn't deserve their service and told the messengers to get out. Whether it was the Kong family or any other scholar, no one was willing to serve a state they considered an illegitimate usurper. Similar scenes of rejection played out in countless places, and 10 days later, we return to the Great Hall where the officials are reporting their failure. Listening to their dejected voices, Xiaji's expression turned as cold as ice. He felt he had given these people far too much face. If they weren't willing to help the country, he decided they would have to bear the consequences. His words were thick with a murderous intent. The officials immediately fell to their knees, pleading with him. They feared such a move would plunge the world into absolute chaos. They argued that killing the scholars would destroy the very foundation of the Wu dynasty. It was, in their eyes, an unthinkable path. But facing their frantic warnings, Xiaji only offered a cold sneer. Since those so-called great families refused to cooperate, he saw no reason to play by their rules anymore. If they didn't want to play the game, he was more than happy to flip the table. If you can't solve the problem, you simply solve the people creating it. And so, carrier pigeons carrying cruel orders began to fly from the capital. They crossed mountains and rivers, heading for every major city. Meanwhile, the noble families were busy celebrating their moral victory at lavish banquets. While drinking heartily, they continued to mock the new regime, calling Xiaji a mere usurper with no real standing. To them, he was just a lucky commoner who had risen by chance, a mud-legged soldier who didn't deserve the service of the elite. They laughed at the very idea of his rule, but their laughter was cut short when a group of Zhao family soldiers burst through the doors. The nobles were shocked, then outraged, shouting that this was the Murong family estate and that these brutes had no right to be there. But before they could finish their threats, a cold voice of judgment echoed from behind the soldiers, sealing the Murong family's fate. Their crimes were deemed unforgivable, and by imperial decree, their house was to be seized. The soldiers moved in, and the cleanup began. The Murong family watched in horror as their kin, the very pillars of their prosperity, fell one by one in a bloody display. Their blood boiled as they roared in madness, demanding to know what crime the Murong house had possibly committed. From behind them, a voice drifted through the air like a light breeze, delivering the verdict Xiaji had decreed, groundless. In their final moments, the members of the Murong family heard those 3 words and fell to shock like a lightning strike. This was the very label the civil officials of the Great Feng dynasty had once used to frame Yuan Jinyuan and Xiaji. Now, in a twist of karmic retribution, it was being used against the elite families. Just as they were about to explode in fury and hurl curses at their attackers, a soldier's blade cut them short, proving that when a scholar meets a soldier, logic rarely wins. Under the same sky that very day, the lights of 16 prominent families were abruptly extinguished as they faced total extermination. Their estates were ruthlessly seized, and these earth-shattering events swept through the Wu dynasty like a violent, unstoppable storm. We see the newborn nation plunged into unprecedented turmoil, yet Xiaji knew that for a country to truly be reborn, this was a necessary step, as the common people had suffered for so long that they had forgotten what it even meant to live. By purging these corrupt families, he intended to show the common people exactly how they were supposed to live. He wanted them to know what it meant to be alive, and we returned to the palace where a very different scene was unfolding. In the Great Hall, Xiaji was shouting at his men to memorize their lessons, promising 20 rewards for those who succeeded. He warned of random checks where a mistake earned 10 lashes, then pointed his finger at a crude board on the wall. It was covered in pinyin letters, and he taught while threatening his audience of miserable-looking generals. These rough, illiterate men scratched their heads in sheer anxiety, their expressions bordering on a total mental collapse. For them, these past few days had been a literal purgatory. Nearby, the former Empress Lu Ruashi approached to watch him. She looked at this man, whom she found increasingly difficult to read, her mind filled with confusion over his strange methods. She knew that if he released movable type printing, it would spark a golden age, yet he chose a much harder path. He used violent means, disregarding his reputation, to brutally purge the elite families. Hearing her question, he simply chuckled. With a dry laugh, he noted there was no grand reason other than his own will. Once he forced literacy upon the common people, and every citizen could read, he truly wanted to see what those so-called scholars would have left to be so proud of. That reality would certainly be quite amusing. Meanwhile, the various noble notable clans and powerful families were busy making their own elaborate preparations. It was like a quiet prelude before a storm. On the surface, the Wu dynasty appeared calm and peaceful, like a mirror-like lake. Deep and serene, yes. However, beneath those unknown undercurrents, the winds and clouds were gathering in a surge of hidden tides. Various conspirators and ambitious men were secretly exerting all their strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were poised to soar the moment the world changed. As time slowly passed, we see the Zhao army's literacy work progressing rapidly. The Pinyin system, which had once helped billions of people escape illiteracy, was now showing its true power in this world as well. Combined with the very real threat of execution for failure, it was a remarkably effective teaching tool. To be honest, fear is a great motivator. Essentially, every man forced himself to memorize the pronunciations. There are no natural fools, after all, only those who haven't been properly encouraged. With a bit of pressure, every problem was solved. The simplified characters proved their worth too, being easy to understand and even easier to write. Naturally, the rival noble families were secretly gathering intelligence on this. It said that many fine treasures were smashed in fits of rage that night. To them, education was a sacred privilege, a lofty pursuit reserved only for the upper echelons of society. They believed that all paths were lowly except for scholarship, but that right was strictly reserved for those of noble birth or high status. To the elites, the commoners and peasants were nothing more than mudlegs who didn't deserve the dignity of literacy. If Xia Ji actually succeeded, these nobles would lose their ability to look down on everyone else from their high and mighty pedestals. They would no longer be able to use birthright or knowledge to justify their contempt. For the great families, this was utterly intolerable. Driven by desperation, the conspirators who had planned to wait suddenly rushed into action. Near every major city, a strange phenomenon occurred. Groups of bandits and robbers, who had supposedly been wiped out long ago, began to sprout up like weeds in a countryside. We see that as soon as one wave of bandits was wiped out, more sprouted up the next day, specifically targeting commoners whenever the army left the city. When the troops went out to hunt them, the bandits simply vanished, leaving the frustrated soldiers scratching their heads in total confusion. In a fair fight, these soldiers were invincible, but when it came to playing mind games, 800 of them combined, to be honest, were no match for the cunning noble families lurking in each city. 3 days later, word of this chaos reached Xia Ji in the palace. His solution was simple and as predictably brutal as ever. If the bandits couldn't be found, he would simply hold the noble families responsible instead. With a massive army at his back, he saw no need for logic. He ordered a total purge. Whether they were involved or not, mere suspicion was more than enough reason for him to act. And so, the order was given. Meanwhile, the nobles were still boasting, convinced they had the upper hand against those they called brutes. They laughed, thinking they had the army running in circles. They assumed the soldiers were losing sleep every night, which they found quite amusing. To them, the world belonged to the elite families. They couldn't fathom mudlegs holding power. The very idea was beneath them, really. They planned to wait until the whole world rebelled. Then, they believed that young emperor would find himself with no place to even be buried. They even raised a toast to their victory, which, naturally, was a bit premature. But just then, the aggressive Zhao soldiers arrived, surrounding the estate entirely. The servants at the gate were terrified and scrambled to report the news. They cried out that it was a disaster. A mob of soldiers had surrounded the house, all of them armed and looking quite dangerous. The nobles rose in a fury, cursing the arrogance of mere soldiers. After all, the great families of the Danyang army possessed limitless resources, and they felt they could easily handle a few troops. They ordered their private guards to be summoned immediately to take the intruders down. But as the words left their mouths, the fierce commanding general led his men forward. Without a moment's hesitation, they smashed through the gates and stormed the mansion, ruthlessly cutting down anyone who dared to stand in their way. It was a display of iron-blooded resolve. Facing the Zhao army, who fought like starving wolves, neither the loyal servants nor the most experienced stewards could do a thing. They were like leaves in an autumn gale, and in the blink of an eye, the old order collapsed. We see the once grand manor, usually filled with laughter, suddenly shrouded in a chilling and murderous atmosphere. A voice, sounding very much like a final judgment, rings out across the estate. The Shi clan of Danyang has reached its end. Their crimes were deemed unforgivable, and the order for their total extermination was given, a grim echo of history repeating itself. The brutal scenes of seizure and execution that once haunted the capital were now playing out in every city across the land. Within a single day, 2/3 of the noble families left over from the old dynasty were simply erased from existence. They never even had the chance to start their rebellion. They were caught completely off guard and nipped in the bud. It seems the time for slow, careful reform had passed. As it turns out, the only truth that mattered was found on the edge of a blade. That day, the empire saw rivers of blood. By the following morning, endless lines of carts were carrying bodies out of the city gates. These mass graves were once reserved for the poor and the forgotten, but now, these former nobles found themselves sharing the same destination. As for the remaining third of the elite families, the news reached them like a thunderclap, and they immediately retreated into the shadows. Most of these family heads were now trembling with fear, deciding it was far better to be a quiet subject than a dead rebel. A few stubborn leaders still harbored resentment and thought of a final stand, but their cries were silenced before they could even begin. The garrison troops showed no mercy, clearing them out entirely. Interestingly, through all of this, the common people remained completely unbothered. To the average citizen, the fall of a noble house was of no consequence. Their only concern was whether they would have enough to eat tomorrow. If anything, watching the corrupt officials and predatory young masters being dragged away in chains was a rather welcome sight. They celebrated in the streets, cheering that these vultures finally got what they deserved. Perhaps, they thought, this new ruler might actually bring peace. We return to the palace, where Xia Ji sat upon his throne, listening to the rhythmic reports of the military's progress. In Shoshan City, the Zheng, Wang, and Song families had been dismantled, yielding over 21 million taels of silver, along with 4 million in gold, thousands of priceless antiques, and 500,000 acres of prime farmland. From Danyang and beyond, the reports continued to pour in, detailing hundreds of thousands more acres and mountains of hidden wealth. In Sheng City, the Li family's hidden wealth, 30 million silver taels, was confiscated along with 600,000 acres of land. At this very moment, these staggering numbers were being reported by the flushed and excited soldiers. Not far from the dragon throne, Lu Ruashi listened until her head began to throb. She stood there in a daze. To be honest, she knew the noble families were wealthy, but she never imagined these local powers were essentially sitting on literal mountains of gold. Combined, this terrifying wealth was dozens of times higher than the entire dynasty's annual tax revenue. We see a faint smile on Xiaoji's face. It was a classic case of dynasties changing while the elite remained ironclad. But unfortunately for them, they had the bad luck of crossing his path. Since 2/3 of them were already gone, he decided there was no need for the remaining third to exist either. He ordered a new policy. Starting today, all land would be nationalized, with compensation paid at market value. From now on, every farming household would be allocated land for free based on their size. They would hold the rights to use the land, but never to sell it. 1/10 of the harvest would go to the state, while the rest was theirs, to use or sell as they pleased. He also waived taxes on reclaimed wastelands and opened the granaries for relief. Then, he established a commercial tax enforcement team. For now, a 30% tax on all transaction profits was set. Those who dared to evade it would be fined 100-fold, then 1,000-fold, and finally, they would face execution. He also abolished all master-servant contracts, effectively ending serfdom. All debt contracts were voided as well, with death promised to anyone who tried to enforce them. These decrees flowed from his lips like a steady stream. Every word was layered with deep foresight. Below the throne, the generals could only stare in absolute shock, while the scribes' hands trembled as they hurried to record it all. A moment later, the rough soldiers rushed out to carry out his will, leaving only 2 people in the hall. Lu Ruashi reclined lazily, her voice tinged with a complex emotion. She asked if this had been his plan all along, to crush the families, seize their riches, and distribute the land to win over the people. It was a path to a new golden age. Xiaoji spoke up calmly. He noted that while 2% of the elite controlled 98% of the resources, they simply weren't strong enough. He didn't have the patience for a slow struggle, so he simply swept them away. Now that 98% belonged to him, our story continues with the redistribution of wealth to the common people. Lu Ruashi let out a soft sigh, noting that this would only solve the problem temporarily. It wouldn't solve it forever. Once the wealth was redistributed, new noble families would simply rise to take their place. She looked at Zhao Qi, wondering if he understood. The noble class, she argued, could never truly be eliminated. And as the emperor, he was effectively the head of the largest noble family of all. Zhao Qi fell silent for a moment. He dared anyone to challenge him, believing the world didn't need so many elites. If he was indeed a noble family, then the people themselves would eventually decide his fate. A flicker of shock crossed Lu Ruashi's eyes as she wondered what Zhao Qi was truly thinking. Yet, deep down, a complex and unidentifiable emotion began to stir within her. To be honest, she found this man quite difficult to read. His methods were undeniably brutal, but every single action he took was aimed at supporting those at the very bottom of society. He understood the suffering caused by land, taxes, and death, but previously, he had been trapped and restrained by the elites. But now he was different. He was now using the most direct and forceful methods to accomplish everything he once feared to try. As one imperial decree followed another, the scholars who had just begun to master the new writing system became his most effective messengers to address any skepticism within the cities. Within just a few days, even the most remote farmers had heard the news. For those at the bottom, this was undoubtedly the best news they had ever received. All debts to landlords were voided, and the dark days of selling children into slavery were officially overturned. Furthermore, there was free land to farm with a mere 10% tax on the harvest. No other hidden fees or taxes would be required. Meanwhile, picture the scene. Inside the luxurious manors of the elite, the air was filled with the sound of smashing porcelain and furious shouting. A 30% business tax? They called it brutal, comparing his military's forced acquisitions to literal highway robbery. To them, the voiding of their precious contracts was simply impossible. But what could they really do? It was obvious that such a radical shift in wealth would inevitably spark a wave of fierce resistance. The remaining third of the noble families began to lash out in desperation, joined by the wealthy merchants who had once profited so handsomely. They were all starting to stir, but this was entirely expected. In any world, true reform often requires a certain amount of, well, unpleasantness. Zhao Qi felt no fear and certainly no pity. For the sake of a brighter future, he was perfectly willing to let the blood flow. Over the next few days, any noble family that dared to defy his orders found their doors smashed in by the Zhao army. It was, for the commoners at least, a welcome sight. We see the confiscations begin once more. The soldiers, now quite experienced in these matters, efficiently seized gold and jewels to be claimed by the state. This time, however, the servants and butlers were spared. Once cleared of any crimes, they were granted their freedom and sent back to their hometowns. There, they reunited with their families to wait for their share of free land. Meanwhile, the wealth from the nobles poured into the imperial treasury. As the treasury swelled, the rewards given to the Zhao army seemed like a mere pittance. Soon, massive construction projects began to take shape. Roads, city walls, and houses were built across the land. It was a massive spending spree, funded entirely by the centuries of accumulated noble wealth. During this time, cement was successfully developed. Additionally, new methods for open-pit coal mining and high-temperature furnaces were introduced. Salt production and other innovations began to benefit thousands of households. Zhao Qi didn't know every technical detail himself, of course, but he knew how to provide a vision and a research direction. By offering rewards that no one could refuse, he motivated the masses. Naturally, skilled craftsmen found ways to make his ideas a reality. Under the promise of great rewards, results were inevitable, an eternal truth, really. On the other side of things, the surviving noble families finally realized the truth. To them, Zhao Qi was nothing more than a royal bandit. They saw him as a total tyrant. In their eyes, his military acquisition of their land had actually been a strange sort of mercy. After all, he could have simply taken everything by force. Instead, he offered a small amount of compensation, better than losing both life and wealth. They knew resistance meant certain death. Since they couldn't win, they chose to flee, hoping to rebuild their fortunes in another dynasty. With their wisdom and hidden wealth, they believed they could rise again. At the city gates, a long line of carriages began to depart. One family had clenched his fists, his eyes burning with resentment. He took one last look at the familiar city, and made a silent vow. He swore that one day, the tables would turn, and Zhao Qi would pay for the humiliation he had inflicted upon the noble families. Then, he led his kin away in a hurried, undignified retreat. The soldiers guarding the gate watched them go with cold, indifferent expressions. However, half an hour later, a general led 100 cavalrymen out of the city in total silence. Sometime later, miles away, "Damn it, it's the Zhao army," the nobles cried out in despair. "Will you not give us even a single shred of hope?" The general appeared before them with a perfectly calm expression. "Don't talk nonsense," he replied. "Right now, we aren't the Zhao army at all. Instead, they claim to be mountain bandits who had only just started their trade, lying with straight faces, without even wearing masks." The general told them to stop talking nonsense. They were wasting time. Once they were finished here, they would simply accept amnesty and go legit. We see the soldiers pounce on the remaining nobles like arrows from a bow. Their blades flashed with a clean, terrifying efficiency. Similar scenes played out near many cities. As time passed, every corner of the Wu dynasty began to witness a new transformation every single day. Driven by the lure of steady wages, countless commoners flocked to join the massive construction projects that were now in full swing. They farmed in the morning and worked for the state in the afternoon. At night, they gritted their teeth and struggled to learn pinyin. Mastering these phonetics meant they could keep working for pay. If they failed, they were hit with a literacy tax, collected every month, without fail. For these poor folks who would normally